Okay, you may not like it, but this is what peak performance looks like. Hey, what's going on, fellas? Welcome back to the channel. Thanks for stopping by again as I kind of slowly rebuild a new library. So speaking of the library, you guys know that we've done a lot of work at LPVOs on this channel. In general, I think they make excellent choice for most shooters, given that year after year, they're continuing to improve. You're getting more magnification in the same scope bodies for less money. So they're pushing those features down to the lower cost level. So I kind of expect that to continue in these coming years. So when something unexpected arrives, I tend to take notice. So when I first saw that QVO tactical video that all of you guys saw for their first Scopeswitch, I was like, what is that? And what followed was, man, I had lots of questions. Fortunately, a lot of those were answered by Antimatter's videos, whether it's their torture test video, which is really impressive, by the way, if you've already seen it, and also their install video, which is really detailed, but we'll talk about it more later. And there were a lot of review videos as well. I can just name a few: Brass Facts, Sage Dynamics, Micah Mayfield, just name a few, and they all did an excellent job. But reading through some of those comments on those videos, I saw one thing that kind of stuck out to me as a commonality. Now, when I read those, I was like, hey, are competitors actually making these comments? Because, you know, I'm something of a competitor myself. So I know there's not a lot of firsthand competition feedback about this product yet. With this video, I hope to correct that. So first thing we're gonna talk about is the install, which I think has been kind of glossed over from other videos, which is a shame because I think it's a major consideration if you think about this product. And secondly, once you have this installed, we'll talk about when this is best used for your type of shooting. Okay, fellas, so this is a difficult install process. At least that's what the first thing you're gonna hear when you watch the Antimatter install video, and that's the first thing you're gonna hear when I'm talking to you here. But hopefully, since I've done it a few times now, I can pass along some lessons I learned to you. Antimatter is available for you to help, and they're very responsive, so they're really great about that. Just remember that their support is only available through email, so you can't call them if you need help right away. Okay, so the install process basically has three major steps. Number one is mounting the scope into the rings. Number two is mounting the slider assembly, the hook. And number three is attaching the ring sleeve and the cables. So the entire process took me about an hour or so to complete with some stumbling blocks along the way. So give yourself plenty of time, especially if it's your first time. So mounting the scope is pretty straightforward. If you've mounted an LPVO before, it's gonna look very similar. So you're dealing with the same steps. The only things I'll mention here is number one is the Scopeswitch only comes in 30 or 34 millimeters. So even though the ring changes, the ring size changes, everything else is the same. You still need to buy a separate Scopeswitch if you want one of each. The second thing you'll notice, it is mounted at 193 scope height mount. You can kind of see why they had to do the 193, because if they did 1.5 standard height, then this hook would be all in your view when you're shooting through it. Now it'd be kind of a cluttered view. And since it is 193, if you haven't shot it before, it does take a little bit of a different cheek weld, right? So it is a little bit more heads up shooting position at 1X. However, if you're in the prone position, it is a little bit harder because your neck is pointed a little bit higher than if you're straight down for 1.5. So it's something you get used to for sure. One other thing to keep in mind is, since it is a taller height, that does affect ballistics a little bit, so it tends to shoot a little bit higher at different distances, and it's more susceptible to rifle can. As to the mounting procedure itself, like I said, it's very straightforward. The only thing I noticed is right underneath here, there's not very much room for a scope level tool. So if you use that, like we showed in the LPVO user, it's too thin to fit. So basically, in order to level the scope, you'll need to use a small set of feeler gauges, or as you can see in my video, I just used a level to match the angle on the scope turret cap and match the angle of the upper receivers. And lastly, when you're mounting the rings themselves, these are torqued down to 15 inch-pounds. So it is a little bit light. It matches what the Aero Precision ultralights are. However, I didn't notice any issues with the scope moving back and forth or rolling in its mount. So I think 15 inch-pounds is fine. And also this is attached to the upper receiver, 45 inch-pounds. So it's super solid. It ain't going anywhere. Okay, so now you're to the second part of the install, which is the slider assembly, the most difficult part. And you're really gonna only encounter difficulty here, depending upon which way your LPVO rotates to magnify. So if it rotates clockwise, like this Vortex Razor, then you're not having extra work to do. However, if it rotates counterclockwise to go up magnification, like the Primary Arms 1-6 Nova, then you're gonna have one extra step. So the Scopeswitch ships with it going clockwise, so that should be good for most scopes. So if you need to change the direction of travel for your scope, that is controlled underneath here by this small little tab with the cable running through it. So basically you have to take that small little tab, undo it, and move the cable to the other side. And then while you're simultaneously holding that small tab, you gotta screw it back in to this hook. So it takes a little bit of fine motor skill, and it's a little bit kludgy. Personally, I told Antimatter myself, you should have just shipped it with like, hey, if your scope rotates to the right, then use this red one. If your scope rotates to the left, then use this blue one. Then basically you swap them in and out without having to go through working through those fine surgery details. Okay, so once you have the hardest part of that little tab thing out of the way, then the last thing you have to do is just place the whole rail part onto your handguard. So you have to experiment with where you want on the rail based on your support hand position. So we'll talk about this more a little bit later, but because this thing, when it moves, it takes a little bit more force than you think it does. For me anyways, like moving a little bit closer to the upper receiver was a little bit easier, and it allowed me to have more leverage than moving it further out. So one thing I did notice, and I ran into this, you may not run into this, but so when I attached this rail assembly to my handguard, every time I screwed these in, my rail assembly would stop moving. It would just seize up. And after days of back and forth between the Antimatter, it turned out that my BCM rail was slightly out of spec on one of my rails. When I changed this to an MI rail, then the problem went away. So hopefully you don't run into that issue, but if you do, that's the cause. Okay, so now you're down to the final part, which is mounting the ring sleeve and the cables, which is not too bad considering that you've gotten past the hardest part, which is the slider assembly. So for the ring, the only thing I'll notice here is it ships with 2 spacers, and neither of the spacers was like a super good fit for any of the 2 scopes I used. So for the first time I did try with the Primary Arms 1:6 Nova, which I shot in the match. I tried the big spacer and that was like too big. So then I tried the small spacer for the Primary Arms, and it was almost just too small. So basically there's like a middle spacer missing. So we got the big one and the small one, and there should have been like a medium one maybe. So when I did the Vortex Razor, I tried the small one because the big one was way too big, and the small one is even too big. So basically what I had to do, and Antimatter recommended this, is I just snapped a Ranger band, aka big rubber band around it to fill the space, and that allowed take up that space and sit really snug against it. So knowing that, maybe Antimatter just should do away the spacer, just ship with a bunch of Ranger bands instead. And lastly, attaching the cables around the sleeve ring is not too bad. Just a couple things. Make sure when you're running the cables underneath the scope mount that they stay in the channel when you're attaching them. Make sure this is forward and as tight as you can when you're pulling on the cables. And the other thing I wanted to mention was here are where all the screws mount. These are actually very sensitive, so you can strip the screw holes if you turn these too tight, finger tight, don't use anything else. I was using a hex screw, and I found out firsthand how sensitive it was, and I stripped one of these screw holes. So once I did that, the ring sleeve couldn't be used, so I had to wait for a replacement, so there was a little bit of downtime. So you got a bunch of small little screws and cables sticking out here where it snaps onto the ring. Somebody asked earlier, hey, if I put this on here, can I still actuate my zoom lever? And yes, you can. I could turn it. You can see me doing it without using the front hook. And because you got like all these screws and wires sticking out here, you basically have to grab it around the sleeve to actuate it like this. Because if you move really quick with your palm on it and turn your hand, it's not gonna feel real good with those screws and wires pressed up against the palm of your hand. So once that's done, then technically you're done. So if you can move this back and forth and this thing moves, then you're done. All right, fellas, so once you have this thing put together, the first things you're gonna notice about its operation, like I mentioned before, it's stiffer than you think it is. It's kind of hard to translate it through the video, but I'll let you kind of listen to it as you're moving it. So you can hear that friction as it moves along this rail, right? So as far as my thumb position, I usually run with thumb over bore anyway, so this is my natural shooting position. If you're running a vertical foregrip, most guys in competition are not, so your natural position is somewhere like here, so in order to actuate the lever, you're gonna have to move your thumb. So as far as getting maximum advantage on this lever, you can leave your thumb here and work it using this joint here, although I don't really like how it puts a lot of pressure on this joint here near my thumb, so it kind of hurts a little bit. So what I've been doing is, instead of doing it like this, I've been rolling it in a little bit further and using this knuckle. I know this looks dirty as hell, but it works really well. So there's no pain, and actually you can move the lever pretty quickly there. So as far as ending position, wherever you end up, whether you're zoomed in or zoomed out, right, you can shoot from any of these positions without moving your thumb again. Now, Antimatter on their website, they publish a spreadsheet that says, hey, these are the scopes we tried, and they list them in order of ease of operation, with one being the easiest. Well, in my experience, I kind of didn't really match that. When I tried the PA Nova, it's probably a 6. It's a little bit on the stiffer side. But this Vortex, I didn't think was super easy. Maybe it was a 5, or slightly easier than the PA Nova. So I can see why, like a lot of videos, people are using the Primary Arms 1/8 compact because that one's super smooth. So as far as what Antimatter is saying, is like your scope choice affects how this scope switch will work. I think that's super important. By the way, so once this thing is mounted, it is 10 ounces mounted. Given that if you're using like a LaRue mount or a Warren mount, which we've used, any type of QD mount, which is going to be around 8 ounces anyway, this is only 2 ounces more, and I did not feel the difference between them. Okay, so now that we've worked the scope switch a little bit, I think it's important to find out when you're gonna use this the most. Just because you have this capability doesn't mean you're like constantly gonna futz with it on a stage. You know, you guys know, having shot a lot of courses of fire, when you need to change magnification on a stage. Now, I've shot a lot of courses of fire as well, and I think that you can generally break them down to these types. Okay, so I think where the primary use of this, as far as max advantage, is gonna be some type of standing zoom. When I say standing, because anytime you're standing and turning the scope lever, that's going to be a lot slower than if you're running from one position to the next and you have distance between target arrays, so you have time to turn your scope lever. So if you're just standing here and turning the scope lever and putting your eye back on it, that's slower than just doing that. You can see that in some of that two-gun national footage that where I shot that match out in Vegas. When I'm coming into position, I'm shooting 1X targets, and I need to turn and immediately brace and shoot a long-range target. So shooting one, then just immediately turn and come into the target. I think for that type of scenario, pretty common in three-gun, that's going to be very advantageous for you. So as a continuation of that stage, you can kind of see where else it would come into play. So as soon as I come out of the VTEC, I'm in zoomed, and then I'm gonna turn, I'm gonna run towards these CQB/close targets, so I can just spin it back down to one, and now I'm ready to engage those. And as soon as I'm done with those, I can turn, spin up again to engage the long range targets. In that kind of stage, I think it's perfect case for this type of scope switch. So you can set up a drill that kind of simulates portions of that, where you're going from max zoom to 1X, or 1X to max zoom, and compare yourself with, hey, I'm gonna shoot it occluded, I'm gonna turn it with my regular scope handle, or I'm just gonna run it with the scope switch. Now for me, I compared it with the other big setup that I'm seeing, especially two-gun nationals, because this is loud, is running offset dot, right? Because when offset dot, you don't have to play with the scope switch at all. You just leave it on max magnification and just use your dot for your 1X targets. And because of that, I think it's important to kind of just run those side by side to see what times you get and see if that makes any sense for you. So the second type you're going to probably run into, and I think it's a little bit less common, this one is similar to use case number one, where you may have a standing zoom, but you're not going all the way to max magnification. So you may be going 2 to 3X. If you have a target that's, you know, very similar to two-gun nationals, where you have headshots at 50 to 70 yards, where you need a little bit of magnification, or red dot's not going to be that great, and then you have to immediately transition to paper, so you need to go back to 1X, and that paper has hostages or no shoots, so you really can't shoot it occluded. Then having the ability to switch it back down to one is really, really nice. And I'm going to lump in one additional scenario into that use case, and where basically sometimes there'll be movement in between. So you're shooting a stationary target, you got to switch back to 1X for some paper in between, and you got to immediately brace again. So in that type of scenario where you're using the scope switch more than once, then that's very helpful. And for use case number three, this is one I've seen in a lot of other scope switch videos, where you're basically just switching between 1 and magnified, back to 1 and magnified, back to 1 and magnified while you're standing, right? So you're shooting everything offhand with no bracing. So generally you don't run in that scenario very often because the long distance targets are separated from a short distance. So you get a little bit of room and there's like a bracing, whatever. But you do have some matches where, hey, you got a piece of steel that's a little bit far away, maybe 100 yards or so. You need a little bit of magnification, and it's like right in the middle of the stage. So you gotta shoot some paper, shoot that steel, then come back to some paper. So having the ability to spin up just a little bit while in the middle and then spin back is useful. And lastly, use case number 4. I haven't tested the one super thoroughly, so it's kind of exists in my head in theory, but I just have just a little bit of data on it. So because now you have the ability to change magnification while you're looking through the scope, because you can do that, I think that your ability to shoot long range may be modified as far as your procedure to something a little bit more beneficial, right? So before you had this, basically you'd come into a stage at max magnification, shoot the first target, come out of the scope, find the second one, slew the gun over, go back to magnified, and then shoot that second target. In this case, you can come in the target, magnified or not, right? Shoot the first target and then zoom down to get an additional field of view, find the second target and zoom back up. In this case, I think it's more useful in like quote unquote tactical scenarios than it is in competition, generally because the targets are a little bit closer together. However, the targets are really separated, and also in tactical scenarios, generally when you shoot targets, they start moving. In 6X, you still have a decent field of view, so if you're shooting a target, you can see the next one in your field of view, and you slew right over to it. But in 8 or 10X, where you have a much smaller field of view, then backing out to 6 and finding the next target and zooming back in at 8 or 10, I think that can be helpful. All right, fellas, so for some final thoughts here, when I first was looking at this product, Antimatter Industries did contact me and said, hey, would you like a sample for a review? And as always, I'm really grateful for companies that reach out to me and want to provide samples for review. We've done several of those products. So as you know, this is a small channel. There's very little clout that we can throw around here. But for this one, I felt that it was important to buy this unit myself for 2 reasons. The first one is I want to use this thing long-term for my own matches to gather more data firsthand. And secondly, I think at $600, which is what they're asking for this, I think interested buyers are going to struggle to see the value in this. And considering like, hey, this ain't a scope where this value is immediately apparent. Okay, so straight up, if you're a dude that just bought an LPVO and you occasionally go to the range with it and you're just shooting targets at your leisure and there's no time pressure, then hey, you don't need this product. And secondly, if your competitor is shooting PCSL or 3-gun open where you can run an offset red dot, well, I think that you just run the offset red dot. You probably don't need this to actuate the lever because chances are most of the time you're gonna run your LPVO max magnification and you're just gonna switch between these two. As you can see in some of the drills, the times are really close, so you're not really buying anything with this. And finally, if you're shooting 3-gun tac optics or you don't have an offset red dot and you just want one and done, and you have one rifle and it's got an LPVO on it, well, I think something like this is actually really handy now that I've played with it a little bit more. So as I said, I'm gonna be shooting this primarily in tac optics and also maybe PCSL without the red dot. And I think it's very helpful when you have like variable distances within the same range and you don't have to think about, okay, hey, I need to be here or I need to run in order to have time to spin up my magnification when you just do it on the fly. So if that narrower window fits your shooting requirements and you're not too invested in scope mounts, then definitely give this a try. And one last point, which is more a general point that you should really ask yourself, do you consider yourself like an early adopter type? So when you see something new, does it like excite you? Like, hey, I can't wait to try this? Or are you the type of person that kind of wants to sit back and says, hey, let everybody else try it and make the mistakes, and then let me try it when all the bugs are worked out? Because if you're an early adopter type, you'll get it first. Chances are it's gonna be more expensive than if you wait. However, if you're the type of person that wants that bleeding edge performance and you're willing to put the time in and troubleshoot, then I think something like this is also right up your alley. All right, fellas, that's it for me. Thanks for stopping by. Like and subscribe. This is a small channel and we're kind of trying to get started again. So appreciate you doing that. Thanks, we'll see you again next time.